Okay, round two, i.e. Unit 2. Unit 1's video review was really long, so unfortunately this one may be equally as long because, well, with Unit 2 we're talking about two main topics. And remember that with your trusty electronic device, such as this iPad here, we can actually look at Unit 2. Once again, going to the Pitt County Schools website, curriculum guides, and we have the Constitution is pretty much the bulk of Unit 2. Also, a little bit to some degree, looking at things such as civic duty, civic responsibility. Also falls into Unit 2. I apologize for not staring at you as I'm looking over this iPad because mainly I am not exactly tech savvy, but at the same time just showing you I do have some technology available to me. My version of technology is, well, a piece of paper with some information and also, well, this. Not my hair, but what limited intelligence I do display at times. So let's get right to the point. So, Constitution. What do we need to know about the Constitution? A whole lot, unfortunately. Let's keep it to the basics. Number one, the Constitution is not our first form of government. Articles of Confederation, dismal failure. Why? Because the Confederation is a group of individual governments trying to work as one. Sort of like federalism, but we'll talk about that later. Confederation is just a loose organization. It doesn't always work. An example of a confederation outside of the United States, you could argue the European Union, simply because you have all these European countries which are sovereign. They have their own rules, their own guidelines, their own government structure, but yet they work together as an economic unit to promote trade, commerce, fancy word for trade, and to just, maintain their borders and work well together like they should. But unfortunately, it's like kids on a playground. You're not going to work well with others at times when everyone wants to get on the same slide and you can only go one at a time. So Confederation for us sounded great. We didn't have a king, a monarchy to worry about anymore. We already got rid of that guy. We're independent, so we want the states to have sovereignty. Well, that didn't work. Basically, there was no central government. There was no executive branch within the Confederation. It was up to each individual state to follow the guidelines of the Confederation Congress and the rules that they passed. That's not going to work because the problems in North Carolina are going to be completely different than the problems in Pennsylvania or the problems in New York or Georgia or any other of the 13 original states. So, no central government, no national court system, so if states have arguments with each other, they would have to be hashed out in the Confederation Congress, and that's just not going to work. It was very difficult to pass laws. It took nearly from 9 out of 13 states to pass a law. It took all 13 states to make a formal change to the Articles of Confederation, so this was a dismal failure. And with any experiment, you need a catalyst sometimes, and the catalyst was Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was led 1,200 people roughly. Daniel Shays is one of the figureheads of the group. They're being taxed to death. Their lands are going to be taken away from these state governments to pay off the war debt from the American Revolution. So Daniel Shays and his rebellion, they go to Springfield, Massachusetts to go to a federal arsenal to get more weapons, more ammunition, to continue the rebellion. The rebellion squashed. So it sends a signal to the 13 states, we need to talk. We need to think about, is the Articles of Confederation going to be effective in the future? It's not. 12 of the 13 states sent delegates to Philadelphia. Philadelphia is sort of like the iconic home of our country. It's not the nation's capital, although it was once during the Revolution. So 12 of the 13 states go. Rhode Island does not go. They think the Articles will work. Just give it some time. It's not going to work. So they get to the constitutional halls, we call it today Independence Hall, and these delegates from 12 states decide to just scrap the Articles. The meeting's in secret. as far as what's going to happen from this point forward. They don't want anyone to know, i.e. the American public, that the Articles is failing and they're going to completely replace it. It could lead to more rebellion, more distrust of government. We have enough of that as it is today. We didn't need it back then. So we had 55 men. They were white, males, generally wealthy, making decisions that would still impact us today. So what happens in the Constitutional Convention? Well, for 6 weeks, nothing. Because there is an argument between two plans of congressional representation. The New Jersey plan that asked for equal representation in Congress. That way the larger states have no more power than the smaller states. The larger states don't like this, so they come up with the Virginia plan. The Virginia plan is based on population would determine representation in Congress. So larger states love it, smaller states hate it. 6 weeks, nothing's being resolved. Eventually we get what is called the Connecticut Compromise, also called the Great Compromise. This more or less took the two plans and pretty much brought them together. Very simple idea, but it took 6 weeks to do it. Two House legislature, United States Congress, House representatives would be based on the population of the state, determining proportional representation. In the Senate, equal representation, 2 from each state. That's settled, things start to pick up the pace a little bit. We have, unfortunately, a compromise that is very controversial, the 3/5 compromise. Southern states said, okay, we got this new 2 House legislature, we're going to dominate the House representatives because we're going to count our slaves to population. Northern states said no, because you don't recognize them as people, you say they're property, why should they count? Compromise. For every 5 enslaved individuals, 3 would count toward the state's populations, or in essence looking at each individual slave as being 3/5 of a person. It gives the southern states some authority in the House, but not as much as they originally wanted. Then we have the Slave Trade Compromise, which allowed for Congress to regulate interstate trade, trade between the states, but Congress would stay out of the slave trade until, 1808. 1808 comes, nothing changes, we still have slavery. Unfortunately, it took a civil war to end the slave issue. What else is in the Constitution? Well, we divide it up into articles. The preamble is the introduction. We're not going to go through every aspect of the preamble, but just know it states the purpose of our government. Examples: to establish justice, provide for the common defense, ensure domestic tranquility. The preamble just simply is an introductory paragraph of this major paper. The articles is the meat and potatoes, the main points. So Article 1, legislative branch. So Article 1, legislative. We're talking about a group that makes the law. Article 2, we are talking about the executive, and I don't have any fancy hand signs for that one. The executive enforces the law. Article 3, the judicial branch is established. The Supreme Court, their job is to interpret the law and to protect constitutional rights. So, we get past Article 3, and going back to my trusty papers here, because I am not a plethora of knowledge, big word, and yes, I do know what it means. But at the same time, I need some backup every once in a while, as any human being would need. So at Article 4, we're talking about an important clause, the full faith and credit clause. With the full faith and credit clause, it basically says that each state is, in a sense, still sovereign, and they're allowed to create their own rules and regulations and have their own established government beyond the national government. But we want the states to get along. So the rights and the privileges of each state must be respected by the other states. They cannot infringe upon another state's government or rights of their citizens. Which brings up the argument of things such as, if one state wants to legalize marijuana or one state wants to allow same-sex couples to get married, what if the other states don't agree? Well, with the full faith and credit clause, technically we don't have to abide by those circumstances of that state if they decide to legalize marijuana or allow same-sex marriage, but we should at least respect their ability to make those decisions. Article 4 talks about the amendment process. It's a proposal and ratification process. 2/3 proposal of Congress, all members of Congress, 535 members, and 3/4 of the states must approve any proposed amendment by Congress. We only have 27 amendments, so it pretty much tells you this process is not an easy process, and it's for a reason. We don't want the will of the people to dictate massive changes in the Constitution. Sometimes the fewer changes you make, the better off you are. That applies to us in looking at the Constitution. So at Article 6, we're looking at Article 6 and we're saying, well, what's in there? Well, basically Article 6 simply says the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, supremacy clause. If a state passes a law that contradicts or conflicts with national law, the Constitution, that state law is not going to survive. It is not constitutional. It will be null and void. That happens, of course, with our federal court system. They handle that issue. Article 7 simply says when 9 states ratify this new document, we have a new form of government. And if you look back at your notes, there's a map on there on that particular slide that shows you the order in which the states ratified this Constitution. North Carolina, we were 12 out of 13, which goes back to North Carolina just being an unusual part of this country when it comes to politics. So what else is in the Constitution that's worth noting? The Necessary and Proper Clause, which is in Article 1 of the Constitution. It simply says Congress has more authority than what is listed in the Constitution. So as society changes, Congress can create additional powers for itself that they deem necessary and proper in carrying out their duties. What else is in the Constitution that's pretty daggone important? Well, certain underlying principles, certain things that helps the Constitution work, such as separation of powers. It goes back to Montesquieu, separation of powers, his notion of three-branch system of government. And with separation of powers, checks and balances. So if Congress passes a law that the president doesn't like, he vetoes it. That's a check. Congress can override a presidential veto. That's a check. The courts can then see this new law and say it's unconstitutional. Judicial review. That's a check. So we just basically keep the 3 branches working in a circular flow. No one branch has more authority than the other. Popular sovereignty, which basically says that with popular sovereignty, the power lies within the people. What is our power? Voting, protesting, sitting on the street corner and complaining about the government, whatever. Freedom of speech. Popular sovereignty means without us, the common citizen, there's no need for this representative democracy. There's no need for federal government or the Constitution. We also look at federalism. Think of federalism as 2 bubbles. You have the national government as a bubble. You have the state governments, all 50 in the same bubble. And they are separate spheres of influence. The state governments are going to do what they feel is best for the people of their state. The federal government does what they think is best for all the people in this country. And they operate separate of one another, except in times where they have to come together, such as in the case of a crisis in a certain state. A massive hurricane hits North Carolina, ravaging the east coast part of North Carolina. The state can respond to our needs, but it's not enough. So what do? They go to the federal government and ask for assistance, such as getting assistance from FEMA, or the president may come and offer additional assistance by nationalizing the National Guard, which is our version of our military at the state level, and he would be in direct control of our National Guard and administer to our needs. That's federalism. And within federalism, we define certain powers. So, you have express powers, that are powers listed in the Constitution, expressly give to the federal government. You have reserve powers, which are reserved to the states, powers that the federal government cannot have or is not denied or prohibited for the states to have, such as establishing marriage laws, public education, the ability to do whatever's necessary in that state, such as passing certain state laws that the federal government disagrees with maybe. You could use the referencing of Colorado when they passed the use of recreational marijuana within that state. That was a reserve power of that state to make that decision. Then we have concurrent powers powers that are shared between these two separate spheres of influence, such as the ability to tax, the dreaded T word. The federal government has various taxes that they hand down to the American people, and on top of that, the state also has the ability to tax us as well. The Constitution sounds like it was an easy argument. They make it one day, sign it the next day, we have a new government. Wasn't quite that easy, because even after this Constitution was written, we had two groups formed. We had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So the Federalists, they were pro-Constitution. They were pro-federal government, pro-constitutional rights of the federal government, the authority of the federal government, the need for an executive branch of government. And three men came together and wrote various documents, essays that were published in the various states trying to promote the states to approve this Constitution. We have James Madison, we have Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Madison eventually becomes president. He was president during War of 1812. Alexander Hamilton was the very first Secretary of the Treasury under the first president, George Washington. Probably would have become president, except he made Aaron Burr mad, a political foe, and they ended up dueling each other, and Burr did not miss, and Hamilton died of his gunshot wound. And John Jay would become the very first head of the United States Supreme Court, Chief Justice. So they were promoting the Constitution. Well, there were people who didn't like the idea of the Constitution. They felt that the states didn't have enough rights. These were the Anti-Federalists. We don't know exactly all the participants within the Anti-Federalist movement, but we do know that probably more than likely one of the leaders was Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry, who gave that famous speech pre-revolution, "Give me liberty or give me death." That's pretty powerful words toward a monarch, toward the king at that time. So these two groups go back and forth, trying to sway the opinions of the American people. If we don't pass the Constitution, the Articles remains. Wasn't working, we're in trouble. So the Anti-Federalists more or less made a compromise by saying, look, we don't like this Constitution. We fear a strong federal government, a strong central government, a strong executive. So we're willing to sacrifice our fears as long as you protect individual rights, you being the Federalists. The Federalists promised that if the Anti-Federalists would support the Constitution, they would give us a Bill of Rights. We have a Bill of Rights. So the compromise worked. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution make up these Bill of Rights. So, with the Constitution, that's what you need to know. Now, with the amendments, we could go into a lot of detail here. I may even seriously consider making a separate review just for the specifics of each amendment, but for right now, let's just stick to the basics. So, what amendments are the important amendments that you need to know? Do you need to know for life, for this class, for the final exam? Well, that changes for each area. So let's just try to stick to the ones that are the most important, I guess you could say. So, First Amendment, 5 parts. All right, you're grasping this amendment with 5 parts, your hand. So, freedom of speech, that's 1. Freedom of religion, 2. Freedom of the press, 3. Right to petition, 4. And then the right to assemble, peacefully, of course. Second Amendment, maybe not so much important for the final exam, but in our neck of the woods, people love the fact that they can own a firearm, right to bear arms. Fourth Amendment, think of it this way: search warrant, right to privacy, no illegal searches or seizures. It also brings up the notion of the exclusionary rule, so that if it's not on the search warrant, it should not be used against you in the court of law. Fifth Amendment, interesting thing with the Fifth Amendment, multiple parts once again. No self-incrimination. I plead the Fifth. You don't have to speak to the police if they are questioning you if you're a suspect for a crime. No double jeopardy. You